everybody. Welcome to today's webinar marks the introduction of Safe and Just Michigan's new report on Michigan sentencing guidelines, a historical and empirical analysis of Michigan sentencing guidelines. We will answer some of your questions at the end of the presentation. Everyone at Safe and Just Michigan is thrilled you are here and joining us today. We have muted your microphones to ensure that everyone can hear the panel, but please ask any questions you have by using the chat function. We will be collecting all the questions in the chat throughout the event. At the end, the participants will have answers for all your questions. You can also engage with Safe and Just Michigan on our social media channel and visit our website. My name is Ronnie Waters, and I will serve as the MC for today's webinar. I'm an outreach specialist for Safe and Just Michigan and a formerly incarcerated individual. Welcome again to our webinar, introducing our new report, looking deeply in Michigan sentencing guidelines. Our first presenter was one of the authors of the report and the founder of the organization, which has come to be known as Safe and Just Michigan, Barbara Levine, who will be discussing the methodology and findings of the report. Barbara Levine began her legal career representing indigent defendants on appeal at the State Appellate Defender's Office before Michigan even had any sentencing guidelines. She was the first administrator of Michigan Appellate Assigned Counsel System, executive director of Citizens Alliance for Prisons and Public Spending, the predecessor to Safe and Just Michigan, and a member of the Criminal Justice Policy Commission. Ms. Levine received both her bachelor's and Juris Doctorate degrees from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. It is my pleasure to now surrender the mic to a living legend, Ms. Barbara Levine.
Hi, everyone. I don't know, that living legend stuff just means you're really old, but I'm very happy to be here today. And I'm going to assume that a lot of viewers don't have much familiarity with the guidelines. And so I'm going to begin at the beginning. And bear in mind, you know, this is going to be a very quick overview. Hopefully it will tantalize some people, at least, into trying to dig into the report, which has a lot of details, but can be read in different pieces because it covers everything from guidelines history to how guidelines work in other jurisdictions to a lot of detail about the empirical research we did on how Michigan's guidelines are working now. But hopefully there's pieces of it that will be of varying degrees of interest to different folks. I'm going to begin with the purpose of and the history of guidelines. Historically, around the country, judges have always used to have complete discretion in sentencing. The only thing that controlled the length of the sentence that they gave was the statutory maximum for the crime, which was set by the legislature. So if the statutory maximum was 10 years or 20 years, a judge couldn't go beyond that, but under that range, they could give a minimum sentence of any amount they wanted to. And the norm used to be that then a parole board would decide when, once somebody had served that minimum sentence, they actually got out up to the maximum. That was the norm nationally, but by the 70s, a lot of people were getting concerned that some people thought sentences were too short, some people thought they were too long, people were concerned about the enormous amount of disparity so that people who committed similar crimes got very different sentences. And a movement began to re-examine the amount of discretion judges had. And different states responded to that differently. Some still have complete judicial discretion. Some have, and others have used a variety of mechanisms to try and constrain that discretion. Michigan chose to go the way of sentencing guidelines. And it's one of about 17 states that have chosen that route, although Michigan's guidelines are very different than what's more typical of other states. The way Michigan's guidelines started was in 1983. It was actually the Supreme Court that initiated having any guidelines at all. And they put together a committee of judges. And that committee then developed guidelines, took a look at how they were working, and revised them in 1988. Those judicial guidelines were designed just to rein in outliers, to sort of constrain the judges whose sentences were way more lenient or way harsher, typically that was the problem, than the norm. So they weren't they were designed to make the vast majority of sentences fall in an average range where most judges would put the typical case of that type. They were only advisory. Judges had to calculate the guidelines. They didn't actually have to follow them. And importantly, and something we'll talk about a little bit more, they didn't apply to people whose sentences were enhanced because they were habitual offenders. In 1994, the legislature finally established a commission to develop legislatively implemented sentencing guidelines. And in fact, those guidelines were enacted in 98. But right after the guidelines were enacted, that commission never met again, and within a couple of years, it was abolished. The purpose of those guidelines was normative. That is, the commission decided for itself what the sentence should be for people who were similarly situated, whose backgrounds were similar, who committed similar crimes. So it was the commission deciding how much a crime was worth. And compliance with those guidelines was mandatory. Judges were supposed to follow them, pick a sentence within the range that the guidelines recommended, unless they had substantial and compelling reasons for either going below or above the recommended range. And what the legislature said these guidelines should do was to protect the public and be proportionate to the seriousness of the offense and the characteristics of the defendant. They also said that the guidelines should be structured to try and reduce disparities based on factors that were not directly relevant to sentencing. And these factors included things that people well knew, that sentences varied enormously depending on the county and maybe who the judge was. And of course, one of the things they were trying to do was reduce racial disparity, which is apparent when you look at who's in our prisons today. So those were some of the main goals. But they also said these guidelines should apply to habitual offenders. And again, I'll talk in a few minutes about the significance of that. Let me go for a minute to how the guidelines actually work. And I think we have a screenshot somewhere of what a guidelines grid looks like. Thank you so much. There are actually 9 separate grids. There's one for murder 2. Murder 1, of course, is mandatory life without parole, so that's not on the guidelines. But second-degree murder has its own grid, and then there are grids that go all the way from A down to H. And the grids are divided according to what the maximum sentence is. So by the time you get down to the H grid, these are meant to be sentences just to a community sanction, possibly including jail. But the sentences that carry life or any term, which is all the most serious offenses in Michigan, because we never actually revised our penal code. The murders, like I said, have their own grid. The rest show up on this, the A grid. And the way these work is judges assess points for prior record variables and for offense variables. And the accumulation of the prior record points appears at the top on the horizontal axis. And you can see if you have 0 prior record points, you're at the A prior record level. If you've got 25 or more, you're at the D level. If you've got 75 or more, you're all the way up to the F level. Similarly, the offense variables, which run on the vertical axis, are scored, and then that puts you into an offense level. And the intersection of the prior record and offense variable levels puts you into a cell. And that cell has a range of months that's supposed to determine the minimum sentence. The judge is supposed to pick the minimum sentence from within that range. Remember, the maximum is still set by statute. But for life maximum offenses in Michigan, unless the judge picks parolable life, and that doesn't happen a lot these days, the judge picks both the minimum and the maximum. So the way the grid is set up, let's look at the D3 cell, which is 108 months to 180 months. The judge picks a minimum sentence somewhere in between 108 and 180 months. And of course, 180 months is what, 15 years. These months translate into a lot of years. And then the maximum is what's set by statute. If the person has been enhanced as an habitual offender, the top end of the cell range is broadened. So instead of 180 months, the judge can pick up to, for a second offender, the range is up to 225 months. For a third offender, it's up to 270 months. And for a fourth offender, it's up to 360 months. So, and these, bear in mind, these, just remember, these are the minimum sentences, and then the max is whatever the judge sets. So, because these guidelines are based on the maximum penalty, not necessarily the nature of the offense, you got crimes against people and property crimes that can be mixed up on the same grid, and you've got different kinds of person crimes that can be mixed up on the same grid. In Michigan, on the A grid, we've got assault with intent to murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and armed robbery, all on this A grid. So, the scoring of these grids can involve a lot of judicial fact finding, where judges have to decide things like what was the person's role in the offense, and how serious was physical abuse that was imposed on a victim, and was there serious psychological injury to a victim's family. And this is very different from other states. In other states, on the vertical grid, on the vertical axis, the offense level is determined just by what the crime is. An armed robbery is an armed robbery. If there's a separate statute that says, no, it's a higher sentence if it's an armed robbery with an injury to the victim, then that's a different crime. But it's just what the nature of the crime is. And then if the judge wants to look at various aggravating factors that make this crime sort of worse than other armed robberies, they can choose to depart from the guidelines. Michigan allows departures as well. The guidelines recommends the range that the judge is supposed to place the minimum in, but they can also go below it, and they can also depart above it. And a lot of sentences we found actually are departures. Only about 55% of the sentences on the A grid are actually in compliance with the guidelines. The rest are departures, primarily downward, but some upward. And I apologize for that. I hope you can all still hear me. He'll quit in a second. The Sentencing Commission intended to do a number of things with the sentences, with the life maximum offenses. And they wanted to preserve broad judicial discretion. They wanted to increase the lengths of sentences, and they wanted to make prior record at least as important to offense severity as offense severity in setting the sentence. As a result, there are a lot of problems, and I'm going to briefly summarize what some of those problems are. I just want to tell you also briefly, since I'm already working on running out of time, why we did this report. We want to encourage the reestablishment of a sentencing commission because nobody has looked at these guidelines for almost 25 years. And we tried to develop data. We did a lot of empirical research to suggest areas where the guidelines might be re-examined, where a new commission might actually examine areas of change. the sentencing guidelines aren't the only thing that determine how long somebody ultimately stays in prison. There are other factors that affect that, but they are critical in setting the minimum amount of time somebody's going to spend in prison. And so it's really important to have this scheme reconsidered. The data we looked at was only the data, although it was about 39,000 sentences, it was the data for people who are convicted of one of the most common life max offenses: second-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and armed robbery. Because these are the cases where judges have the most discretion. These are the cases where problems with the guidelines are most manifest. And these are the cases where sentences are longest and have the most impact on defendants, on defendants and communities and defendants' families and taxpayers, because they have the most impact on the size and cost of the prison population. So what are some of the problems? For one thing, the ranges, as you could see from that example, are very, very wide. When the width of a range is as much as 7.5 years or more on the murder grid, depending on how serious the prior record is, the ranges can be 15 years. And when a judge has that much discretion, you're not doing anything to control. It's very minimal constraint on discretion, obviously. And the result is enormous disparity. The guidelines are not addressing the problems of disparity that they were in part meant to address. And in directing judges how to score the guidelines, Michigan uses only aggravating factors. Judges can only score things in a way that makes things worse because there's no credit given for mitigating factors. I mean, judges can ultimately choose to go downward, but it's downward from a determined guideline range that does not include mitigating factors. In addition, the guidelines were set up to require the judges to count whatever the highest score possible is for that particular variable. Judges can't say, well, I could give you 50 points for this, but I don't think you really did it as badly as this, so I'm just going to give you 25. Can't happen. They have to give whatever score is assigned once they make a finding. There's a lot of double counting in the guidelines. So for instance, anybody who's convicted of assault with intent to murder or murder is going to get scored. Obviously, they have to have the intent in order to be convicted in the first place, but then there's a guidelines factor that scores a lot of points for intent to murder. So you're double counting the fact that intent existed. A lot of facts get double counted. The use of a weapon shows up in a number of different ways. Prior record is structured so that, well, you get more points for your prior being a high severity felony as opposed to a low severity felony. High severity felony is defined to be any prior felony that carried a maximum of more than 4 points. More than 5 years. That includes, as high severity, things like meth possession and delivery of drugs under 50 grams and uttering and publishing. I mean, what's considered a high severity felony takes in a really broad sweep and means that people get a lot of higher scores for prior record. They score the real offense so that they're looking at not just the elements of the offense for which people were convicted, but they go under that and look at the facts. So if somebody pleads down from armed robbery to unarmed robbery, but there was actually a gun involved, they're going to get points for having used a gun. That armed robbery is the real offense. And even though your maximum sentence may be lower, you're still going to get a minimum that takes into account the real facts. And there's a lot of scoring of prior record to include prior bad behavior that may never have even been charged or convicted. And that takes into account charges that were dismissed in plea bargaining. So for instance, if somebody commits a robbery and at the same time they strike the clerk and lock her in a back room, so that theoretically she can be charged, the defendant can be charged with armed robbery, assault, and kidnapping. The assault and kidnapping charges may be dismissed in plea bargaining, and the defendant may only be convicted of the robbery, but those other two charges are going to get points because they were concurrent charges, even though they didn't result in convictions. It goes on and on like this, and we discuss in much greater detail in the report, obviously, but another one is the relationship to the criminal justice system. So, for instance, if somebody commits a crime while they're in jail awaiting trial, they get extra points for it if they do something inside, smuggling or assault on another prisoner or whatever it is. And if they're actually doing a sentence in jail or doing a sentence in prison, they get lots of extra points, even though the system already has ways of punishing people who have a relationship with the criminal justice system that wasn't enough to deter them and they go on and do something else. So for instance, if you're serving a sentence for whatever, it doesn't matter what, it can be a relatively low level sentence, and you get found guilty of being a prisoner in possession of a cell phone, which is considered a dangerous thing in prison, you can get 20 points for your relationship to the system, for the very fact that you were in prison when you committed this offense, even though by definition the crime requires you to be a prisoner in order to be guilty of the offense. You get 25 points for being a threat to the security of a penal institution, and the sentence will be consecutive to the one that you're currently serving. So the minimum just gets blown sky high by double counting and triple counting the fact that you were a prisoner. I want to take the last minute here. This is obviously sort of all over the map, but to address habitual offender statutes, because habitual offender enhancements. We have a statute that allows judges, where the prosecutor chooses to file an enhancement, it allows the judge to actually sentence above the statutory maximum sentence. So if you're sentenced as a fourth offender, you can get a much higher sentence than if you aren't sentenced as a fourth offender. But that goes to the maximum. What the guidelines do is build in, and as I showed you on that chart, there's a way to widen the ranges if somebody is charged, widen the ranges on the minimum sentence if somebody is charged as an habitual offender. If you're a second offender, the guidelines range is 25% higher. If you're a third offender, it's 50% higher. And if you're a fourth offender, it's 100% higher. There's a lot of problems with this. Number one, because of course the guidelines are already built to take into account your prior record. So by definition, prior record is being double counted. There's enormous disparity because prosecutors are all over the map. Some prosecutors enhance everybody who's got any priors. Some prosecutors are very selective and don't use enhancements and use enhancements very sparingly. Some judges look at the enhancement and use it seriously to lengthen a sentence. Some judges say, hey, I already know what their prior record is. I'm not gonna double count it. So the use of the enhancements is a way that really lengthens sentences for some percentage of people. And it does it not only by counting the same offense that was already scored, but in some cases, it counts offenses that couldn't be scored, because there is a way for some cases, for some priors to roll off if they're old enough. It's a process, it's not easy, but if they're really old enough, they'll roll off, but there's no limit under the habitual statute for which priors, what the nature of them are, or the age of them are. So they can be counted in habitualizing people and then used to increase the guideline score, even though that prior couldn't actually be scored as a prior record variable. This gets confusing. There's a lot of details to it. People from other states look at our guidelines and they throw up their hands and say, oh my God, how do you guys even do this? You know, it's like really much more complicated than it needs to be. And, yesterday I talked about this for an hour and, and didn't get to everything. Certainly in 25 minutes, we're only going to, scratch the surface. If you have questions, obviously we'll talk about them at the end, but hopefully with our report online, you'll choose to look at it and learn more. And bottom line is, you don't have to understand every detail of the guidelines to support the notion that it's time to reinstate a sentencing commission and to rethink, to take a good hard look at how each of these variables is working, at how the structure of the guidelines is working. This is a new time. People's attitudes have changed. These guidelines were built in the tough on crime era of the 90s, and it is time to take a hard look at what we're doing to people we sentence and how much we're paying for people we're sentencing. So, and last thought, the guidelines, the emphasis on prior record is also very problematic because it has an adverse racial impact. There isn't a lot of evidence of overt racial bias at the point of sentencing. Judges don't look at people and say, oh, well, I'm going to give you an extra 10 years just because you're Black. But of course, there's a lot of bias in the system that works its way downstream from the point of arrest. And prior record tend to be heavier prior records for Black defendants in particular. It starts with juvenile adjudications and arrest rates and everything else, but heavily counting prior record then causes that disparity to get embedded. Thank you, everybody, for your patience, and I hope I didn't infringe on other speakers too much.
No, thank you, Barb, for that. You actually have more time if you need it. Yeah. Okay, our next presenter is Joshua B. Hull, discussing the chapter on public safety and recidivism. A little bit about Josh. Josh B. Hull is our Chief Policy Analyst here at Safe and Just Michigan. Before working at Safe and Just Michigan, he was a consultant with #Cut 50, working to pass the federal First Step Act. He's also formerly incarcerated and hosts the Decarceration Nation podcast. Josh holds a master's degree in international relationships from the University of Central Oklahoma. The floor is yours, Josh.
Thanks, Ronnie. As just mentioned, my name is Josh. I am a policy analyst at Safe and Just Michigan, and today I'm kind of covering the non-technical aspects of the report. Thankfully, Barbara got to do the technical aspects of the report. Starting in the 1970s, the United States started on a national bipartisan experiment committed to putting a lot more people in our prisons and jails. As the Brennan Center put it, incarceration grew both at the federal and state level, but most of the growth was in the states, which housed the vast majority of the nation's prisoners. The number of prisoners grew in every state, blue, red, urban, and rural. I remember when I was a kid, people actually firmly believed that people who committed a crime were and should be getting rehabilitation in prison, and that when they got back from incarceration, that they had served their debt to society. Somehow, over the ensuing decades, we became committed to a much harsher view of prison, where you actually often see people cheering for violence in our prisons, and to a mindset of locking people up and throwing away the key. And now at the state level, our prison populations are increasingly made up of people with long and indeterminate sentences. This was certainly true in Michigan and continues to be true here in Michigan today. In the 1970s, less than 5% of people sentenced for second-degree murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and armed robbery had minimums greater than 20 years. Today, that number is often as many as 15 times greater. We could probably spend hours talking about why this happened. We've had 30 years of tough on crime television and movies. We have media that largely programs and churns out column inches using the mantra, if it bleeds, it leads. And way too often, we tend to legislate from anecdotes as opposed to data. But there's also a deep belief that long sentences are just desserts. Many people believe that when someone has done serious harm, they should do substantial time. This report is certainly not trying to suggest that those people are necessarily wrong, but I do think it's important to note that what does seem to have changed is our perception of what substantial time means. Where in the 1970s, people thought a 10 or 20 year sentence was significant, Now we frequently see sentences of 40, 50, 60, or even hundreds of years. In fact, over 40% of the current population of people incarcerated in Michigan's prisons are serving a sentence of over 10 years, when in 1993, the number of incarcerated people serving those kinds of sentences was 21%. And today, around 20% of Michigan's population of incarcerated people is serving a term of over 25 years of life, while internationally, in the 44 countries whose data is reported by the Council of Europe, their data suggests that only 1.5% of their incarcerated populations were serving a sentence of over 20 years. Michigan might be in step with this unfortunate national trend toward longer sentences, but this trend itself is out of step with history and out of step with the rest of the world. This change in thinking about crime and sentencing over the past decades has probably also had other effects. For instance, crime has largely become disaggregated from prison sentences. As crime has generally decreased over the last decades, our prison population has largely stayed the same. And yes, lately, Michigan's prison population has declined. But if what we've been doing is clearing out what we have sometimes called the low-hanging fruit of people with shorter sentences, but this happened while our sentencing practices have pushed for more severity, the actual long-term effect will likely be larger, longer, and more aging prison populations. It is also very useful to look again at these recent declines through a historical lens. In 1993, our prison population was 38,942, and in 2017, our prison population was 39,666. Well, that sounds similar, right? But perhaps the most interesting thing is that during that same period, index crimes dropped by more than 56%. Again, there could be many causes for this, but I suspect it has something to do with how people who have not been directly impacted by crime perceive stories about crime as opposed to how they personally experienced crime. But that again is beyond the scope of this report. At the end of the day, crime has largely been in decline, with the exception of a homicide and domestic violence spike throughout the pandemic period, while long sentences and incarceration have continued to increase. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, in case you didn't know, I'm formerly incarcerated, as Ronnie mentioned earlier, and so I get to speak to this with a little bit of firsthand experience and with some authority. If you ask pretty much any formerly incarcerated person who they are most worried about in our prisons, it is almost never the people who are doing long sentences. In fact, in most prisons in Michigan, the folks doing life sentences are leaders and often represent the glue keeping down violence in our prisons. Generally, in my experience, the most violent prisons in Michigan are level 1 prisons and not the higher level prisons. This accords with decades of evidence that suggests both that people who commit serious crimes have very low recidivism rates, and also with decades of evidence that suggests that crime is a young person's game and that people age out of crime. Sonia Starr and J.J. Prescott put out a study a few years ago which used Michigan data and suggests that people who are over the age of 50 and who served at least 5 years have an active recidivism rate of less than 1%. They also concluded that policies that seek to shrink the expansive prison population while ignoring prisoners who have committed violent offenses will fail to address the core of the problem. Ultimately, as these numbers continue to increase, any hope of reform will have to center around people whose crimes are considered violent or serious if we want to have any hope of meaningful reductions in our prison population. We will need to move away from pretrial, prison classifications, and parole decisions without using the violent label, and we'll have to shorten prison sentences and lengths of stay for people convicted of violent offenses. We will have to consider changing our sentencing guidelines and investing in back-end reforms like prosecutor-initiated second look or more general second look legislation. But you might ask, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to change our sentencing practices? Well, obviously, the first reason is the human cost. I have a lot of friends who did long sentences and who have come back to their communities and become important and valuable members of those communities. I often tell the story of my friend who, after just a few years, after being resentenced and released from a juvenile life without parole sentence, who was opening warming centers in his neighborhood during a polar vortex. People change, and over decades of time that change is almost inevitable. One of my very good friends, a Vietnam veteran, came back from doing over 40 years in prison to be so impactful that he was elected to the Bishop's Committee at our church just a year after release. But unfortunately, due to years of poor health care when he was inside, he went mostly blind just a year after release. I often wonder if his sight might have been saved by getting better health care if they just let him out a few years earlier. There is also a net widening problem. As we've become committed to ensuring that serious crimes get treated with ever-increasing harsh consequences, we have started to label more and more crimes as violent crimes, as serious crimes, as habitual crimes, and even as serious misdemeanors, in order to ensure that more and more people get longer and longer sentences. And this net widening has real impacts on the respect for the rule of law. For all the talk of the Ferguson effect, there is also a very real possibility that the different standards by which we judge violence have real implications on how people perceive the credibility of the rule of law. As law professor David Sklansky explained in his recent book, A Pattern of Violence, the common distinction between violent and nonviolent acts played virtually no role in criminal law before the latter half of the 20th century. Yet to this day, with more crimes than ever called violent, the distinction determines how we judge the seriousness of an offense, as well as the perpetrator's debt and danger to society. Similarly, criminal law today treats violence as a pathology of individual character, but in other areas of law, including the procedural law that covers police conduct, the situational context of violence carries more weight. The result of these inconsistencies and of society's unique fear of violence since the 1960s has been an application of law that reinforces inequities of race and class, undermining the law's legitimacy. There are also massive monetary costs. The cost, for instance, of incarcerating just one person convicted of armed robbery has grown over the last decades by $124,000. That's just for one person. Lengthening the average sentence of 100 people in prison for armed robbery would cost taxpayers over $12 million in that same time period. According to the House Fiscal Agency, over the 15-year period from 2006 to 2020, per prisoner costs for health care increased by an average of 7% annually, and almost certainly the largest driver of that cost was people doing long and indeterminate sentences, and health care is the largest cost in the prison budget. We have very crowded prisons. We have an aging prison population, and at the time of this pandemic, we have staffing shortages and a lot more people needing health care. Obviously, there are also public safety costs. When Jennifer Granholm doubled the number of people paroled in 2009, the data shows that over 99% of these folks who were paroled never returned to prison. We also tend to believe that prisons are a solution to crime, but there have been multiple studies, including a very good meta-analysis by Rudman of the Open Philanthropy Project, that concluded that prison is no panacea. The best estimate of the marginal impact of incarceration on crime in the U.S. today is zero. The claims that increasing the severity of incarceration even mildly deters appears weak. After effects appeal to cancel out incapacitation in most contexts. In other words, prisons also generate violence inside. We almost never talk about this, but many people are subject to violence and trauma on a regular basis, and some people even die. In fact, over 150 people, mostly people with long and indeterminate sentences, have died in Michigan's prisons just over the last 2 years as a result just of the pandemic. One has to wonder how many of these 150 human beings remained a real public safety risk, and how many people in their communities, their parents, their kids, their friends, their partners, mourn their loss today and every day. Was it really necessary to keep all of these people for such long sentences? As Dr. Homer Venners talked about in his book Life and Death in Rikers Island, incarceration harms health. And many of the people that we are leaving behind bars were themselves traumatized by crime. People's stories are often much more complicated and nuanced than the simple descriptions of subhuman monsters that we hear so often on television and in the media. Several years ago, Dr. Bruce Western did a sociological study of people returning home from prison in Boston. He published a book about it and said, "Violence is a lifetime reality for people who go to prison. It grows out of the chaotic context of poverty and its accompanying disadvantages. Given the contextual character of violence, the roles of victim, witness, and perpetrator are not neatly divided among individuals. Instead, one comes to play all of these parts as their life course unfolds. A key implication is that those with a history of offending have been victims and witnesses to violence for even longer." This is so critical. It is important that we look beyond our solutions that have largely failed us for so long and open ourselves to new ideas. When you meet the people who've been through this, you know there have to be better ways. Bruce Western also said, "This moral complexity where victims and offenders are often one and the same is challenging for a justice system designed to assess guilt or innocence and mete out punishment. Historically, we have punished violence as an assault of the strong on the weak. The larger challenge now is to heal the frailty from which violence springs." I understand how complicated all of this is. As someone who's been both a victim and perpetrator myself, it took me years to make sense of my own feelings about all of this and to come to some conclusions about what needs to be done. What good does it do to continue to be part of so-called solutions that make the core problems facing our communities worse? At times it might make for good politics, but it almost never makes for good policy. And at the end of the day, we should be about trying to make our Michigan community safer, and that includes our communities and our members inside prisons. As the authors of the report we are talking about concluded, imposing long sentences in the name of public protection is both ironic and counterproductive. Such sentences are unsupported by actual data on recidivism and are almost always imposed on the people who are the least likely to repeat their offenses. They substantially hamper the ability of people to be productive and self-sufficient when they are eventually released, and they require taxpayers to spend tens of millions of dollars annually for the illusion of increased safety. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of this webinar, and take a couple minutes or a half an hour or an hour of your day and try and read the report. I'm now going to pass it back to Ronnie. Thanks, Ronnie.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. That was well said. Good job as usual. Our next speaker is our Executive Director, John Cooper, who will be talking about what we can do with all this information. In other words, what safe and just recommendations is for next steps. Take it away, Josh. John, let me tell the people a little bit about you before you take it away. As Executive Director, John has been primarily responsible for many of the successful legislative campaigns we have led over the past several years. Before working with Safe and Just Michigan, he worked in the office of David LeGrand, Representative David LeGrand. And before that, John spent 7 years as a litigator in Washington, D.C., office of Lengthen and Watkins LLP. He also serves as a law clerk to Honorable Boris F. Martin, Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Cooper attained his Jewish doctorate from the University of Virginia School of Law and graduated with honors from Calvin College. Now take it away, John.
Thanks, Ronnie. It's a very, very kind intro. And thanks to Barb and Josh for sharing the research. I think the data is compelling. I mean, our guidelines have very clearly driven up sentence length in Michigan, and we should say also that truth in sentencing is a huge part of that as well. The truth in sentencing law was tie-barred to the guidelines when they were passed in '98, and that is a big part of the story as well. But I'm going to focus just on the issue of sentencing commissions and why we think having one in Michigan is important. I know it's a little bit of a dry subject, but we really do think institutionally that's one of the major things that needs to happen before we see reforms around the guidelines. So Michigan is a real outlier when it comes to commissions. just about every state that has sentencing guidelines has a sentencing commission, and that makes sense. The guidelines implement sentencing policy, and oversight is needed to determine whether they're meeting the goals. If you want consistent sentences across the state, if you want proportional sentences, then you need to gather data and actually measure whether you're getting those things statewide. And that was one of the major goals of this research project. As the report notes, every jurisdiction with guidelines assumes the need to have a commission that not only develops guidelines in the first instance, but also monitors their implementation, collects, analyzes, and publishes data regarding their effectiveness, recommends changes necessary to promote the guidelines' goals, responds to changes in law and policy, and avoids the inconsistencies that can arise from ad hoc legislative amendments. And, it was quite odd how we ended up without a commission, because there was a commission created to create the guidelines. They were enacted in '98. The commission worked for several years in the '90s to put them together. And it looked from the mandate as if ongoing oversight was contemplated. But after the guidelines were enacted, the commission was defunded and it never met again. It was ultimately disbanded a couple years later. But it seems to me that there was a desire among those that were involved with that to lock in the guidelines and evade oversight. And I think it's high time to be looking at them with a much more critical eye, particularly given what public attitudes were around punishment and sentence length in the '90s. They're intended to be punitive. That's among the goals that the commission actually stated, was to increase sentence length for the most severe crimes. So, the number one recommendation of our report actually is to create a commission. And I want to just talk first, why we think commissions are really important. And second, why we think doing the commission is the thing that we should start with, instead of something we could do later or along with some of these other policy goals. So the case for a commission is pretty straightforward. You've got this massive criminal justice system. There's 250,000 criminal cases that go through the courts every year. There's a couple 100,000 people that are involved in the system at any given time in Michigan. And as a matter of public policy and good government, we should really have a better sense of whether sentence length and sentencing policy is serving us. We have quite long sentences in Michigan. The average minimum sentence is now over 11 years within the system. That's something that's crept up from about 7 years since 1998. We're also seeing a much larger percentage of very long indeterminate sentences. Those are ones we sort of, as an organization, look at the more than 20-year minimums. And that as a group was, I think it was 3% of the prison population in '98, and it's now more like 18%. And that has been offset by a decline in the number of parolable life sentences that are being meted out. But it's quite clear that long indeterminate sentences have become a much bigger part of the story of Michigan's prison population. So, we're in thinking through why we would want a commission, in addition just to the sort of understanding whether the system is working. There's a lot of data collection that could be done. The jails are run locally at the county level by the county sheriffs, and there's no sort of statewide collection of jail data. So we just don't have insight into what's happening across the jail system, and that data is not integrated with the prison data. Probation data, whether it be misdemeanor or felony, is held in different places, and there's not common definitions of recidivism across these systems, those are all things that a sentencing commission or a criminal justice policy commission could look at, and it would be helpful in understanding whether our system is working very well. This is something we see with the Department of Corrections recidivism data. They define recidivism as a return to prison for any reason within 3 years, but that's not capturing, jail or probation necessarily, or if someone's back in the system 4 years, et cetera. So there's really it's not a useful measure to look at how people are actually doing. It just looks at whether MDOC has people coming back or not. I think there's other issues that I think are pretty important to, the legislature has very strict term limits. It's 3 terms of 2 years in the House and 2 terms of 4 years in the Senate. And there just are not that many lawyers, particularly lawyers with expertise in criminal law within the legislature. And there's a huge amount of turnover. About 1/3 of the House turns over every 2 years. And to do a big project like revising the sentencing guidelines or passing major reforms around sentencing, that is going to be very hard to do directly in the legislature. And we think a policy commission might be able to help manage that process better. And also just, bring a lot of institutional knowledge as a permanent body, one that we can appoint experts to, one that could bring in outside experts. I think it'd be a much better process within a commission, with the commission making recommendations to the legislature than trying to work directly in committees. So as far as why we think it's important to start with the commission as opposed to some of the other recommendations for reform, it really boils down to thinking that having a commission set up and working within that commission is just going to be more effective than working within the legislature for a variety of reasons. And then in terms of what the commission should look like, we actually think we have a pretty good model for what this should look like. There was relatively briefly something called the Criminal Justice Policy Commission. It was created by statute in 2014 after it was one of the recommendations that Council on State Government's Justice Center made after a years-long study of the prison population. And the commission was in operation for about 5 years, but it had a sunset, and the bill to extend its term didn't make it through the Senate in 2019. But we actually think, I think the report actually says specifically, establish a commission with the mandate and scope of authority of the former Criminal Justice Policy Commission. And one of the things we like about the CJPC was that it wasn't just focused on sentencing guidelines. It was quite a bit broader. It requires, the commission to look at population projections within the system, cost issues, recidivism. So it's a much broader mandate, and it could be sort of a body that offers technical assistance to the legislature on a variety of policy issues. The commission itself was, I think it was 17 members, but it was large. It was a pretty insider commission. It was very heavy on institutional actors. So there's representatives from the district judges, the circuit judges, the attorney general's office, the prosecutors, the criminal defense lawyers, et cetera. That is a pretty common way of doing these things in Lansing. We think those are many of the right groups to have at the table, but would be interested potentially in having directly impacted person on the commission, perhaps some broader expertise. But I think we're likely in our conversations with lawmakers to start with the bill that authorized the Criminal Justice Policy Commission and make revisions to that. One other thing I would recommend to lawmakers is the commission only had one full-time staff, and that really wasn't enough to get done a lot of the things we'd like to see it do. We've looked at other state commissions. Many of them have, 10 or more staff members full-time, and we think that kind of commitment is warranted, just given that, this is a multi-billion-dollar system we're talking about. And as the report points out, I mean, right-sizing some of these sentence lengths could actually save us a ton of money. I think $1.2 billion during the study period is the cost of the long sentences that the report details. So there really is a lot to be gained by doing the work of studying the system and understanding where it's not working, and putting in the work to make the structural fixes that are needed. With that, I will wrap up and turn it back to Ronnie.
Great. Thank you, John. That was on point as usual. Now we have time for some Q&A. There's a few questions in the chat. One of them was, how does the grid indicate with your, how does the grid interact with your felony murder laws? It said Michigan has not gotten rid of the felony murder statute, but is given credit for doing so. John, you might can explain to them.
Yeah, it's first degree murder is it's a mandatory minimum of life without the possibility of parole. So it's not on the guidelines. Mandatory minimums are not treated through the guidelines because there's no judicial discretion there.
Okay. Another question is, what actions need to be taken or are being taken to get the policy commission, and how can I help?
Well, I mean, call your lawmaker for sure. Lawmakers are probably not going to be expecting phone calls about a policy commission. So I think that would be super helpful. Certainly, if once we get legislation introduced, there'll be the opportunity to, talk to lawmakers, attend hearings and the like. I don't know what the timeline for that would be. It depends a lot on what conversations with lawmakers end up being like.
It's another question for the panel. Is there a full list of offenses to which Michigan sending guidelines apply?
There is. It's actually printed in the back of the guidelines.
I think Barbara was answering. She was just muted for a second.
Okay, go ahead, Barb.
No, but what John was about to say is correct. There's a whole manual on how the guidelines operate, and at the back of it, there's an appendix with all the statutory offenses. The guidelines apply now to every offense, every felony offense, not misdemeanors, but every felony offense in Michigan, except, like John said, first degree murder because it's mandatory, and felony firearm, which is a flat 2-year sentence. And that's also mandatory until SJM manages to change that, but that's another project. Yeah. So the guidelines apply to everything where judges have discretion. And I want to echo, take 1 second to echo something John just said, because you'll see if you look at the full report in chapter 17, we have a whole series of recommendations. Some are much broader than others. Some go directly to the structure of the guidelines, and some go to, if the guidelines aren't structurally changed, even as they are now, how could the scoring of particular offense variables and prior record variables be improved? And as much as I certainly would like to see some of those improvements made very quickly, and the legislature could do them, a lot of the problem has been with ad hoc changes by the legislature. And my fear is that if we ask the legislature to start making individual changes, fix this little thing and fix that thing, then they declare victory and go home. You don't have an integrated change to how the guidelines function. And so it's best to have a commission. Our recommendations hopefully would get considered, and the very detailed empirical research would get considered by a new commission. But ultimately, recommendations to be made would be made to an integrated, comprehensive structure that the commission recommended.
Just one more question. The CJ Commission was not particularly affected in my mind. Will the addition of staff make that much difference?
Maybe I can take that one because I was on that commission. If you're talking about the Criminal Justice Policy Commission that John described as having been around for several years, only several years, it wasn't that effective, and there were reasons for it. Towards the end, the leadership of it changed, some of the membership changed, and there was starting to put out, they started to look at what's called the straddle cells, those areas where judges have the discretion as to whether to sentence people to prison or to community sanctions. And there was a very good report put out. Part of the problem certainly was lack of staff. And John's absolutely right. This needs to be a grown-up commission with a substantial staff. But it needs to be one that's determined to do it. And I think with the right personnel and the right leadership, it could be very effective. So, but I won't dispute that the last incarnation was disappointing.
Yeah, I would just to echo Barb, I think towards the end of its tenure, there actually was a lot of activity, and it was functioning much more along the lines that we'd like to see. It took some time to get there.
And then time ran out. The other thing people should bear in mind is that these guidelines apply to every offense. And the original Sentencing Commission did some good things in terms of defining which offenses should never go to prison. Now, then they created these straddle cells where judges, again, have an awful lot of discretion about who goes to prison and who doesn't. And bingo, there's disparity among counties on how that gets implemented. But there was definitely, it's not that everybody got longer sentences. You know, there were people who were getting prison time for things that are now being steered into community sanctions. And that's why our report focused on the most serious offenses that almost always result in prison, and for which the sentences definitely have been increased and are continuing to increase.
It's a question off Facebook. This person wants to know do we ask the lawmakers to establish this commission, or has anyone introduced a bill?
Not yet.
Yeah, no, there's no bill yet. We haven't talked to any lawmakers about specifics yet, but we hope to start working on that in the coming weeks.
We're hoping the report will help kickstart the process. I mean, this is just being rolled out now. That's why you've got the webinar now. And so hopefully this is the beginning of something that, in the end, lawmakers, this isn't such a hard one for them, because they don't have, if you're not asking legislators to change anything specific about the guidelines, to change any scoring or to change any actual statutory penalties. If all you're asking them to do is to establish the commission that then hashes out all these details and all the controversies within the context of commission meetings and brings a completed product back to the legislature a few years from now, then it's not something that needs to be very controversial with legislators. They just need to be persuaded that it's necessary and that there's no reason for them not to do it. I think, John.
I think we'll find out
We'll find out, right?
But hopefully not. Yeah.
Okay, everybody. My name is Ronnie Waters. On behalf of Safe and Just Michigan, I would like to thank everyone for their participation in today's webinar. Keep an eye out, because we will be hosting more webinars down the line throughout the spring and summer. Thanks, everybody, for participating, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.